I have been procrastinating for some time on filming this video. I've even made myself a cup of tea so that halfway through I can reward myself and have a little break, because August was my best reading month of all time. I read a lot, and that means that we have a lot to get through today, so strap up. You're gonna wanna make yourself comfortable. In August, I'm gonna put this down because it's super hot. In August, I read over 5,000 pages for the first time ever. I smashed my magical readathon TBR. I cleared a bunch of books off my TBR that have been on there for months because I just haven't been reading a whole ton. And today we're gonna be talking about them. But before I get into the stats where you are going to see like truly the amount of books that I read in August, I do first have a message from the sponsor of today's video, which is the wonderful Book of the Month. Book of the Month are a monthly book curation service that ship to the US and Canada. Every month the editorial team reads through hundreds of titles to bring you 5 to 7 of the hottest books of the month at an unbeatable price. Book of the Month truly have some of the best prices on brand new hardcover releases. As well as hardcovers, Book of the Month now also offer audiobooks. So if audio is your jam, you can now download the Book of the Month app, and instead of a hardcover, if you so fancy, you can choose audiobooks, download them into the app and listen at your leisure. So just before we get into my September picks, which I'm very excited about, if you would like to check out Book of the Month yourself, you can head to the link in my description box, enter the code Becca at checkout, and you will get your very first Book of the Month for just $9.99, a brand new hardcover release for just $9.99. Now let's crack this baby open because I am so excited for this book. Look at the autumn vibes. They are unparalleled. You Again by Kate Goldbeck is the romance pick for September, and I am so hyped about this because this is enemies to friends to lovers. This is following a comedian and a chef who despise each other, and the reason why is because they are sleeping with the same woman. Now many years pass and they don't see each other until one day they meet again after particularly harrowing breakups, and they slowly become friends, which then slowly blossoms into something else. So not only do we have a particularly autumnal romance, my second pick for September is a horror. You can tell that we're getting into spooky season over here. So this is a story about a therapist and a self-help writer that buys an infamous murder house and intends to live in it. But as the renovations are continuing and continuously going wrong, our main character Sarah starts to slip out of reality, and as she is peeling back the layers of the wallpaper, she's also peeling back the layers of the Blackwood house, which seems to have not finished claiming its victims. I love a murder house, I love a renovation, and I also love this cover, so I'm really excited to see which direction this story goes in. So if either of these books tickle your fancy, do not hesitate to click on the link in my description box, enter the code Becca at checkout, and get your very first Book of the Month for $9.99. And of course, a big thank you once again to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. So cracking on with these stats, in the month of August, I read a grand total of 5,328 pages, which breaks down to an average of 171 pages per day. I meant business. For the star ratings, these surprisingly leaned towards the lower end of the scale. We had 2 2-stars, 5 3-stars, 4 4-stars, and 1 5-star, breaking down to an average of 3.3 per book, which is a little bit low for me. In terms of the demographics, I read 9 adult books, 1 new adult and 2 young adult. For the formats, I read 4 standardly formatted novels, 3 arcs, 2 comics, 1 audiobook, 1 ebook, and 1 collection of short stories. Truly a mixed bag. For the genres, I read 4 fantasy, 2 fantasy romance, 2 paranormal, 2 sci-fi, 1 dystopian, and 1 thriller. And finally, for the places where I sourced these books from, 5 of them were books that I hauled in 2023, 3 were from my own TBR that existed prior to the start of 2023, 3 were sent to me by the publisher, and 1 I read on Kindle Unlimited. Now before we get into the successes of the month, I do want to touch upon my 1 DNF, which is a little bit sad because it not only marks the end of a book for me, like because I DNF'd the book, it also marks the end of a series because I won't be continuing anymore, and that was Blood Sanctuary Part 1 by Vila Roth. So this is book 3 in the Bloodgrace series. This one is a very slow moving adult political fantasy romance following the bastard daughter of the king who wants to get in touch with a Hesperine. Now a Hesperine is a vampiric creature, and the Hesperines are sending a delegation of emissaries to the human lands to renegotiate the terms of a peace treaty that has lapsed over the last couple of 100 years. Cassia wants to speak to one, although we don't know why at the beginning of the first book, and so she negotiates her position at the the royal court for summer, when normally she would do everything in her power to be as far away from her father as possible. So book one mainly takes place over a series of conversations between a Hesperine, Leo, and Cassia in the nights leading up to the spring equinox, when the culmination of the peace talks is going to happen. So I really liked the first book in this series. I gave it 4 stars, and it was very slow paced. It was very info dumpy. It had a ton of dialogue, but it also built to a climax, and the climax in book one was 5 stars. I loved it. Even though the build-up was very, very slow and tedious, I kind of assumed that that was going to be, because this is like an 8-book series and I don't think it's finished, I assumed that that was going to be the start, like a very slow start to a series. So we were laying the groundwork in book one essentially to have things like speed up and be a little bit more interesting later down the line. Sadly, that was not the case. So in book two, we had no conflict at all at the end. It was just very slow. The relationship in here as well is very low stakes. Like, I have no doubt that these two are going to be together forever, and there is very little believable conflict that could happen in this world. Aside from the situation that's kind of outside of the main characters, the plot has the potential to affect their relationship. But what I was seeing 200 pages into book three is that since the end of book one, you have a small time jump, and then a week has passed at most across like 800 pages, and that's just a little bit too slow for me. The main character was starting to have some doubts about herself and the relationship that she was in, and it just wasn't believable to me because it's so obvious that the stakes in this relationship are like so low. So while the terms of the plot have the ability to affect the relationship, I kind of needed to see that coming through, and it was just taking far too long to happen. So I decided to cut my losses with this series. This unfortunately does mean that I'm DNFing my Patreon book club series, but we are picking a new one that is going to start in October, and I think, because I know what it is, I know it's a series that I already enjoy because I've already started it. My first full book of the month was Emily Wilde's Encyclopedia of Fairies by Heather Fawcett. This one is an adult cozy fantasy about a woman who is trying to put together the world's first encyclopedia of fairies. It's historical. I can't remember exactly when it is set, but potentially it's like the late 1800s to the early 1900s. It's 1909, and the book is formatted as a diary, and it's a diary of her expedition to this island that I think is off the coast of Norway, where she is looking to discover this island and like record this island's fair folk for the first time, and have like discovered essentially this species of fair folk. So she makes her way to this island where she is very poorly received by the locals, and because of this she's very much struggling to make any progress with the project, up until her academic rival Wendell Bumblebee turns up and wraps the townsfolk around his little finger within seconds. So I enjoyed this one. I did end up giving it 3 stars because I had a good time with it. It reminded me a lot of An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson, in that it is purely vibes, and while there is a plot there, the vibes are, I would say, the most dominant part of this book. So if you're looking for a fun, cozy fantasy in like an isolated island setting with some humor and a really good atmosphere, I would definitely recommend this one. But while I had a good time with it, this is a series and I have no desire to continue on with the series. This was enough for me, which isn't a bad thing or anything, but I would say I just liked this book. There was no point throughout it that I felt that I was truly invested in it, but I do still think it's a good time and I did really enjoy it. If you do like this, I would definitely recommend giving An Enchantment of Ravens by Margaret Rogerson a try as well, because that is another book where it's like more atmosphere than it is plot, and I really liked that one. The second book that I finished was not a magical readathon book, but it is a whopper, and it definitely contributed to this month being so successful for me, because that was The Shadow Rising by Robert Jordan. This is the 4th book in the Wheel of Time series, which, as I'm sure you all know, especially if you've been here for a while, is an adult epic fantasy series that is a classic struggle between the forces of light and dark. So in this series, we are following the reincarnation of a pivotal figure in this struggle, which is the Dragon Reborn, and the Dragon Reborn has the power to either make or break the world. So we are following this age's reincarnation of the dragon, and also a handful of side characters that are Tarvaren, who are people who have the ability to influence the weave of the world, so like change the events that happen every single age. This is a lot of people's, not necessarily favorite, but this is like a standout volume in the series to a lot of people. I think this installment for me really nailed the things that I like and I don't like about this series. I think that this world is very complex. I think this plot is very complex, And I feel like for somebody who reads like I do, constantly hunting for Easter eggs, this series overall is going to be a treasure trove. And we, for the first time, in my opinion, saw some of that illustrated in this book. And those bits I loved. If you watch my spoiler video for this, you will see every time I notice a tiny bit of the plot and I'm like, oh my god, like I can't believe that this is happening. But I really do not like the delivery of this book. I don't like Robert Jordan's writing. I think that potentially at this point in the series, my opinion on Robert Jordan is that he is a talented story crafter, but I don't think he's necessarily the most talented writer. Something that the thing that frustrates me the most about this series is that it is very, very repetitive, and not in a way where like plot points are being hammered into you or anything. It's more like every 10 pages you'll have a little side tangent about how men are like from the perspective of a woman that's like, oh my god, men are so funny, like I treat my husband like this to keep him in line. Then 10 pages later you'll have one about women from the perspective of a man. And to me it kind of feels like being in the pub with a bunch of old men who are constantly telling you the same little anecdote over and over again. It's like when I used to go see my great granddad, wonderful man, adored him, loved his stories, but we were getting the same ones over and over and over again, and they were these just like funny little anecdotes. But in a book it's not cute. When I was going to see my great granddad when I was 5, loved it. In here, not a fan. So I gave this one 3 stars. I am willing to continue on with the series, but at this point I've accepted that I don't think that any of the books in the series are going to be 5 stars to me, because I don't think that the intricacy of the plot is ever going to outshine the tediousness of Robert Jordan's writing for me to say I love this book. But I do feel like I could get to a point where I'm like, I love this plot. Potentially. My third book was one of my 2 stars, which was, to be fair, I didn't really go into it expecting to have the best time, but it was Unearthed by Amy Kaufman and Megan Spooner. So if you guys have read one Amy Kaufman book, you have read them all, and this is truly no exception. This one is about 2 characters who are going on an expedition to a planet that they found out about in a message that was left behind by an extinct alien race, and they're going there to discover the secrets of this alien race to hopefully bring back supplies to Earth that will help to reverse the environmental collapse of planet Earth and save some of humanity. Very soon when they land on this planet, they do encounter a temple where they're hoping to find this treasure, and they have to solve the puzzles left behind by this alien race to be able to proceed and eventually win their trove. Amy Kaufman, and I say Amy Kaufman because like Megan Spooner did write this, but this also is very much like Illuminate, the Aurora cycle, which Amy Kaufman wrote with Jay Kristoff as opposed to Megan Spooner. It's also like the other Amy Kaufman, Megan Spooner series, which is it The Shattered World? They're all very much the same. It's like a fun sci-fi plot with the same copy and paste characters across all series, so you always know what you're gonna get. And I think in this one it just became a little bit tedious for me, where like nothing is pushing any boundaries. Like Amy Kaufman in this book and Megan Spooner are not pushing the boundaries of anything that they've ever written before, in my opinion. So it was just losing my interest a little bit. I also think that while the plot of these characters moving through this temple and solving puzzles sounds really cool on the surface, I very quickly discovered that watching or reading other people solve puzzles is not fun. Like solving a puzzle yourself is fun, but the puzzles weren't described in a way that like maybe we could puzzle it out as a reader before the characters did. So I just didn't find that element of it interesting. There was an overarching plot in here that did keep me going, because I almost DNF'd this, but it kept me going until the end. And that was about this alien race and some of the clues that they left behind, and how like if they're aliens, did they leave things behind for humans to find? Like if they were extinct theoretically before humans were ever created, how could they create puzzles that humans are able to solve, you know? So that kind of kept me hooked to the end, and while it answered some of my questions, it did, in typical Amy Kaufman style, end on a cliffhanger. But I am going to cut my losses with this duology. I think it's a duology. I'm not going to be continuing because overall this didn't hold my interest enough. It was just fine, you know, like it wasn't terrible. I just wasn't really that into it at any point other than to find out the deal on how this alien race had left all of these temples and puzzles behind. Book number 4 was Lore Olympus Volume 4 by Rachel Smith. If you are unfamiliar with this series, it is a fantasy romance webcomic. It's a retelling of Hades and Persephone that has been bound up into physical volumes, so you can read this online for free. It has all of the gods in it, but they are modernized, put into like cities, made relatable. There's some humor in here as well, but it also does not shy away from some of the darker elements of the gods, like toxic relationships, domestic domestic abuse and sexual assault. So do be careful of that when you're going into this. But the relationship between Hades and Persephone themselves is like just a super sweet slow burn. And I adore this comic. Like, this comic just makes me so happy. I gave this volume in particular 4 stars because with it being such a slow burn, I feel like my enjoyment and my rating of each installment very much depends on how much Hades and Persephone page time we get. And in this one, like, it wasn't the most, but the side characters still bring like so many extra dimensions to this story. We're still like fully fleshing out the story of Hades and Persephone, but not only them, also all really of the gods of Olympus and the underworld. So yeah, I had a really good time with it. It's just like, in comparison to volumes 1 and 3, wasn't quite my favorite, but I love this series, so I still loved it, you know. I then read my favorite book of not only the month but also my favorite book of the year so far, which was Lightbringer by Pierce Brown. We all knew it was coming. We had no doubts that this was going to pull through and be phenomenal, and I'm not even mad that Pierce Brown took so long working on this now, because it is truly a masterpiece. So if you are unfamiliar with the Red Rising series as a whole, it is a sci-fi series that's set in space, but it has a dystopian like overarching plot, but it reads like a martial fantasy. So we are following a young man called Darrow, who is a red in a color caste system where reds are at the bottom and golds are right at the top. So the reds believe that they are mining for a valuable substance called helium-3 so that humans can terraform the galaxy and escape the dying planet Earth. But after Darrow's wife makes herself a martyr to spur Darrow into action, he goes to the surface of Mars and realizes that the planets have been terraformed for quite some time and his people are being kept in slavery. So in that moment, he decides to join a rebellion and infiltrate the golds with the intention of tearing them apart from the inside. So this series has 2 story arcs. The first 3 books are like a trilogy, and then the second 4 books are a second story arc that takes place 10 years after the end of book 3. So the way that I like to describe the plot of this second story arc is that we've won the war, but we haven't won the battle. And this second arc deals with a lot of the consequences and repercussions of Darrow's actions from the first trilogy. Now, I read the first trilogy in 2021 and I wasn't reading the second story arc until we had a release date for this. So I read Iron Gold and Dark Age very recently in the lead up to Lightbringer's release, and the beginning of this story arc kind of picks apart some of the characters that we know and love to put them into a position where I feel this book can happen. Dark Age in particular was indeed very dark and it took a lot of the characters to a very low place, and Iron Gold was the start of that. So I had forgotten, with having read the first trilogy so long ago, I had forgotten about the joy and the happiness and like the good moments that Red Rising could deliver, because what sticks in my mind is the wild plot twists and the betrayals and the destruction. I forgot about all those good moments, and we haven't had a lot of them in the past 2 books. And Lightbringer to me was very reminiscent of like Golden Sun and Morning Star, and that made this book even more heartbreaking. This book broke me and I thought that it wasn't going to, and I sobbed through the last 2 pages. Like, this I feel has cemented Red Rising as my favorite series of all time, and I'm still hesitant to say that because I haven't read the last book and it could end terribly, and I believe that it will because I know Pierce Brown as an author. I'm so an author of this, at least. I'm so excited but also nervous about what he's going to write when he's done with the Red Rising world, because obviously we have nothing to base it on. We only have Red Rising, so who knows what direction he's going to go into after that. But I love this series because of the plot twist, because of the betrayals, because Pierce Brown does not pull his punches. He delivers the gut punch and I feel it. So yeah, if you're a fan of heartbreak, if you like books that hurt, then I would recommend that you pick this up. Also listen to the audiobooks because they are phenomenal. I was very dubious when I found out that Lightbringer wasn't going to be a full cast audio after Iron Gold and Morning Star were, but Timothy Gerard Reynolds did not let me down. The audio performance was phenomenal and I am shooketh. I'm trying to hold on to some of the memories from this book while simultaneously trying desperately to forget it, and I'll let you know how that goes because as of yet it's not going well. I then read a few arcs, starting with an old one that I hadn't managed to get to last year, which was Gleanings by Neil Shusterman. So this is a collection of short stories that goes with the Arc of a Scythe series, which is a young adult utopian series in a world where humanity have conquered pretty much everything that can kill them. So you can't die of disease, you can't die accidentally, you can't be murdered. If anything happens to you and you die, you'll just get revived. So the only problem that humanity still has to face is population control, which is where the scythes come in. In this world, there is a governing body of scythes that are tasked with keeping the population down. So they have a quota of people that they have to essentially kill every day / week / month, and each scythe has their own way of going about this. So in the core trilogy, we follow Citra and Rowan, who both become apprentice scythes, and they both end up going on two very different paths with an overarching plot of corruption within the scythedom as well. So this is a collection of short stories that was published 3 years after the final book in the Scythe trilogy. Some of the stories predate the series. A lot of them happen at the same time as the series. We have some like prequels and origin stories of some of the characters from the Scythedom, and some of these stories, like none of them were necessary, and some of them were quite bizarre. Like some of them were generally just meant to be fun. But the reason why, because I'm not a short story person, but the reason why I wanted to read this one is because my favorite thing about the Arc of a Scythe trilogy was the actual world, because this world was so fascinating, so well fleshed out, that I thought that Neil Shusterman only used a corner of this world and only a small percentage of story that could have been told. And I felt like he had endless possibilities for spin-off series in this world. So this I would say is absolutely not necessary. I ended up giving it 3 stars. One made me tear up a little bit. I think that one was called The Mortal Canvas, because there's a lot to say in this world, especially about the nature of humanity and also mortality, which I feel like is the main kind of message you get from this series. But overall, like, I wasn't digging the ones that were just kind of like a fun jaunt throughout the world, and like it was just fine, you know. It's a collection of short stories, so I would never was gonna love it. I also have a degree of distance from the Scythe series now, because it has been 4 years now since I read the final book, and that was my main kind of worry going into this anyway, with it being published like 3 years after the main trilogy. I feel like if this had been published in 2020, I would have enjoyed it a lot more, because there's like, I know that this short story collection references finer points of the trilogy that I no longer remember, and if there was a spin-off or a continuation of the Scythe trilogy, I absolutely would reread, but I'm not going to reread the trilogy for the benefit of a short story collection. So I know that I definitely lost some of the finer points, and I just feel like this was published at a really weird time. I then read Masters of Death by Olivia Blake. This one is a paranormal jaunt, I want to say, very much in the style of Emily Wild's Encyclopedia of Fairies, where it's just like a very fun, vibey book. It is also a standalone, so you'll read this, you'll have a great time, and everything will be wrapped up. But this one is about a real estate agent that is a vampire, and she is trying to sell a haunted house. However, the ghost that resides in the house has been murdered, and he won't move on until he gets to the bottom of his murder. So the main character employs the godson of death, who is a medium. However, he's actually a phony. He doesn't communicate with the dead at all. He just summons Death, who is a character in this world, gets Death to communicate with the dead people and passes the message along to Fox, who communicates it to his client. That's kind of the setup. All I'm going to say about the actual plot of this is that it is about a game. Now, I loved the start of this book because I love the eccentricity with which Olivia Blake tells stories. I love the eccentricity with which she puts together plots and how that filters into her writing. It has an element of pretension that I actually really enjoy, which I typically don't when it comes to pretension in general. However, about 100 pages in, we just had a lot of characters. There was a lot of scenes with them all in the same room at the same time, and it kind of got a little bit hard to follow and a little bit convoluted in that the plot was hidden by continuously misleading conversations to make you wonder about what the plot was, and that got a little bit tiring. The other reason why I didn't adore this book, or while I still really enjoyed it, is because a lot of it is intangible. Like the nature of the actual plot when we got there, which was about 170 pages in, we found out like what the characters had to do to resolve the plot in this book. The nature of the thing that forms the plot is super intangible. It's not necessarily real. It doesn't really have any rules, and that's just not something that my brain can get behind pretty much ever. I like my things to be concrete, well thought out, explained, and like logic based, and not saying that it's bad if they're not those things, just it hurts my brain. Like we all know that ambiguous and intangible things just don't gel very well with me. That being said though, I really love Olivia Blake's writing style. We had a few like poignant speeches in here about like mortality. There's also some romantic plot lines in here that I really enjoyed, so I gave it 4 stars. It's like a low 4. Really enjoyed it, but at the moment I think I prefer the Atlas 6 to this one. The last arc I think that I read was probably my second favorite book of the month, and that is The Pomegranate Gate by Ariel Kaplan. So this one is a historical-ish fantasy. It's in an inspired world, not an actual historical setting, so I think that that technically makes it not historical fantasy, but it's set in a world inspired by medieval Spain, and it does contain real-world religions. So this is set at a time where the Jewish population of this country are being told that they either have to convert to Christianity or leave. So our 2 main characters are Naphtali and Toba. Naphtali has access to a dream world that his father also has access to, but his father has always refused to explain this to him. And our female main character can't move at a pace any faster than a walk. She can't speak at any volume that is louder than a general speaking volume, but she can translate languages and write with both hands at the same time, like 2 different languages. So they are part of a caravan that is leaving this city when Toba gets separated. She gets waylaid by this guy that she can't escape from because she can't run and she can't scream. And Naphtali sees this. He follows her into the woods and he sees her disappear into the Pomegranate Gate, which is a gate to a demon dimension. So from there we are following Toba as she is found by one of these demonic creatures in the demon realm and taken to their elaborate but also abandoned castle where they vow to keep her safe even though she shouldn't be in this dimension. And we also follow Naphtali, who is traveling with Toba's grandmother and also an old woman to hopefully try and get Toba back and then get back on the road to their assumed like freedom and safety. I loved this story. The reason why I requested this from or accepted this from the publisher is because I thought that it seemed very similar to the Winternight trilogy. I would say that if you are a fan of the Winternight trilogy, there is a very good possibility that you will enjoy this, but I also feel like if you are a fan of the City of Brass, you might enjoy this as well. While we obviously have the Winternight influence or reference in terms of it being a historical fantasy that also has like a folklore in it that forms the bulk of the fantastical plot on the background of the historical plot, and something that's really cool about this world as well is that they're mirrored realms, so the fantastical conflict and the historical conflict are affecting each other because something that happens in one world also happens in the other. But we also have this second dimension that our female main character goes to, where she meets these demonic creatures and goes to their court and meets like their rulers, and that very much reminded me of the City of Brass, as our main character was visiting and finding a place in this world as the main character does in the City of Brass. I also got very slight ACOTAR vibes, and I don't want you to pick this up based on a comparison to ACOTAR because it's not like a fantasy romance or anything, but the way that Toba was taken to this sprawling but abandoned estate where this scholar and his nephew are the only person that lived there, and like they vow to look after her even though like it's a kind of a criminal offense for her to be there, and also the way there is this other kind of like government that's going on in the background that like isn't the best in this demon world, was giving me like a little bit of first book ACOTAR. So yeah, I had a really good time with this. I'm very excited to pick up the sequel when it's released, hopefully next year. And yeah, this is one that I'm thinking about, like this is still living in my mind rent free. Book number 9 of the month I think was a survival thriller called The Edge of Collapse by Kyla Stone, and I really enjoyed this one. I gave this 4 stars. It completely took me by surprise because I had very little expectations going into it, but this one is a survival thriller set in the very near future where an EMP has hit the United States, so all of the computers and the electricity are like off the grid, and we are following a woman who was kidnapped 5 years prior to the start of this story. She is heavily pregnant, so content warnings in here for sexual assault, which is alluded to but not described in book 1 at least. There is torture, kidnap, and also stalking because the other or one of our other main characters is the kidnapper himself. So the EMP goes off Our main character finds the cage to her prison open, so she obviously takes this opportunity to escape, while also following the serial killer as he arrives at the cabin where he's kept her and realizes that she has escaped and sets out to find her. And then we also have another character who is an ex-soldier whose life was ruined by the EMP, and he's just trying to make his way back home, and he encounters our main character and they are trying to like survive the wilderness together. I think it's set in Michigan and I think it's very, very cold. It's like in the middle of winter. Also content warnings for animal abuse in here and also violence, but I found this so riveting. If you're a fan of The Butcher and the Wren by Elena Urquhart, then I feel like you might enjoy it because it has the same kind of juxtaposition of the female main character and then the like in the mind of the serial killer, or in this case the kidnapper. So yeah, I flew through this and I read it across a day, but I think in total reading time maybe 3.5 hours. So you can tell that I was into this. It read super quickly. It was like 300 pages. It is the start of a series and I am excited to continue, as I think because our main character before she was kidnapped was married and had a kid, and I think book 2 is following her husband and child that she is desperately trying to get back to. Like that's her motivation for trying, like the place that she's trying to get to is her home. Yeah, I think book 2 follows the husband and the kid because obviously this EMP has affected the entire world. So yeah, I've never read a survival thriller before. This was my first one, and I didn't expect anything going into it because it's just like a KU survival thriller, and I ended up really enjoying it. Book number 10 was one that I didn't really expect to read, but I was doing Bookopoly sprints, I think, or was I sprinting with Leanne? I had to change book anyway, so I picked up the next installment of the Buffy reboot comic, which was the second half of Chosen Ones. So this is a collection of short stories set in the Buffy world, or the Buffy reboot world. Some of them, or the majority of them, are following historical slayers. I gave it 3 stars. It was fine. I struggle, as I've discussed in this video, with short stories anyway. So for this to be short stories in graphic form, obviously they're even shorter than your average short story. So I did enjoy some of them. I will say that I really loved the Sisters of Angelus. I would sign up to the Sisters of Angelus in a heartbeat. But yeah, this is just like filling in some of the backstory of the Buffy world. There was also one following Buffy, which is weird actually, because this one in particular is in the timeline of the main story where I'm currently up to in the comic, so it's weird that this was included in a short story collection. But yeah, I don't really have much to say about it. Like, it was just fine. I only read half of it anyway because the first half you read earlier on in the reading order, but Sisters of Angelus was definitely a standout. I then read technically my 3rd short story collection of the month, which was A Night of the Seven Kingdoms by George R.R. Martin. This one is a prequel to the A Song of Ice and Fire series, aka Game of Thrones, and we are following Dunk and Egg as they travel through the 7 kingdoms and get involved in some shit. So Dunk is a hedge knight. We start off where his master, his knight, the knight that he squires for, has died, and so Dunk is full of good intentions but like not the most brain cells, as he goes to a tournament and tries to make a name for himself, having pretty much no experience as a knight, and along the way he takes on a squire called Egg. Now I don't know if it's a spoiler to say who these characters are because I went into this knowing who they were, so I don't know if it's a spoiler to tell you, so I won't. But because of Egg, Dunk actually does end up making a name for himself, and so after this tournament he and Egg continue to travel through the 7 kingdoms to give Egg experience as a squire, because this is his first time being a squire, and for Dunk to kind of build his reputation as a knight. He is very well intentioned. He has the honor of a knight, but he is also a lot of the time very out of his depth amongst the scheming of Westeros. This was interesting to me in the little tidbits of history that we get about the Song of Ice and Fire series, because my favorite thing about Game of Thrones is the world and how well thought out it is, how well developed. And because when you watch Game of Thrones, House of the Dragon, and also when you read like Game of Thrones, it's kind of like historical fiction, because the thing that we're mainly, and it is inspired by historical events, but like the thing that we're mainly following is the struggle for the throne in A Song of Ice and Fire, and then we have some magic stuff that kind of gradually builds moves throughout the series. The whole point of Game of Thrones is that everyone's focused on the throne when they should be focused on something else, and that reflects in how the focus of the books is more on the throne than it is on like the magic. So because of how much work George R.R. Martin has put into his world building and the history of his world, it does kind of feel like historical fiction because everything makes sense and can be tracked back through generations. So this was interesting to me in terms of like, this is set like 100 years before Game of Thrones, and some of the characters in here are referenced, like Dunk himself is referenced by Jaime Lannister in, I don't know if it's A Storm of Swords or A Dance with Dragons. So that was super interesting to me. But in terms of it as a story to be enjoyed, I didn't love it because little like episodes around Westeros of like jumping in, saving the day, or kind of like doing a good thing or like making the right decision isn't something that I typically enjoy. Like, I'd rather read an epic fantasy than a short story collection. So as an accompaniment to A Song of Ice and Fire, I enjoyed it. As a story to be read on its own, it was fine. I gave it 3 stars overall. Really valued the little nods and references to the main series that we got, and also filling in some of that history, but like I didn't have the best time reading it, you know? And then our final book for the month was sadly a 2-star, but one of the most bizarre 2 stars that I have ever read. I'm really going to struggle to describe this to you guys, I can tell you that now. This is The Song of the Marked by S.M. Gaither, and it is the first book in the Shadows and Crowns series. This is a fantasy romance. I kept seeing it around. I gave in Double Points Weekend in Waterstones. I bought it on Saturday and I started it on Monday. I was real eager. And this is about a thief called Cassia who has had an illness called the Fading Sickness, which is plaguing the land. And she hasn't died of it, even though everybody else has. And her adoptive mother also hasn't died of it, because Cassia goes to the ends of the earth, figuratively, not literally, to get a flower that is used as a medicine on her adoptive mother. So one day when she's doing this, she gets captured by like the captain of the guard to the king and taken to the king, who notices that because of her fading sickness, she may potentially have an affinity to people with the fading sickness, or may be able to sense something about them that the average person can't. So he sends her on a mission along with the captain of the guard to see if she can find anything out and like help to save the realm from the fading sickness. There's a lot more going on. There's gods, which is what the magic derives from. The king himself is not well regarded amongst the public, but he seems fine in the interactions the main character has with him. She also has some friends, which are kind of like her, I guess, thieving crew that end up part of the plot. And there is a romance in here as well. I gave this 2 stars because I could not focus on this book to save my life. And you know, like sometimes you're just not in a reading mood, you just can't focus. I thought it was potentially that, but I picked up other books alongside this, like towards the end of the month I dipped in and out of other things and I could focus on them fine. The writing style in here to me is just really not engaging. This was compared to Throne of Glass and also Blood and Ash. I think that that's an inaccurate comparison, I would say. I would compare this to both of those things based on it having elements of both of those things in it. But like how I recommended the Pomegranate Gate to you guys if you like the Winter Night trilogy or City of Brass, that is because I believe that the Pomegranate Gate shares similar traits to those series while being as good as those. I feel like if I recommended this to you based on Throne of Glass, you would be disappointed because it feels like I don't want to be mean. You know that I'm not mean when I review books. I tend to talk from my perspective as like my opinion on a book, as opposed to like saying this book is terrible, it's horrible. And I don't think that it was, because I actually kind of liked it, but I feel like it is a shallow version of Throne of Glass, where the main character in here is essentially Selena Sardothian. The relationship and the banter, which was my favorite thing, I really liked the banter in here, is very much like Poppy and Hawke from Blood and Ash, but I don't think that it's executed in a way that is even a fraction of what Throne of Glass is. And even Blood and Ash, even though I don't love that series, I gave up after book 3 because book 3 just sent the whole thing off the rails. I feel like you can't argue that Jennifer L. Armentrout's writing is super compelling, and this was like the exact opposite of that. That being said, am I going to read the sequels to this? Yes, very much. I am. And why is that? Why? I could not tell you. I literally could not tell you, because the romance and the banter in here, like the banter is a solid 8 out of 10, I would say. Romance in itself could take it or leave it. The world building felt very, like it felt like it was giving the illusion of a fleshed out world without actually being fleshed out. So it had like it read to me like it had very little depth and was just like, oh, this is how the magic works. This is the god system. Had an interesting plot twist at the end, but in a way that like the plot twist was cool, but I don't think necessarily the delivery or the, I guess, execution in further books I don't feel is going to be like the best thing I've ever read. So I don't want to continue for that. But if this was a KU book, I can tell you I 100% would have started book 2 immediately, and I can't tell you why. So take from that what you will. Read this if you would like to. Maybe if I do pick up book 2, which, because normally in this case where I gave book 1 2 stars, I would say, oh, like I'll give book 2 a try and then make a decision based on like, I guess, a feeling of obligation to continue a series and give it a chance. I don't do that anymore. I'm trying to be very good about cutting my losses and saying like, I'm fine not to read book 2. So it's not me feeling obligated to read book 2. It's like, I want to read book 2 in this series. Like I really, like if I had book 2, I would have started it immediately. It is an incredibly fast read as well, but I never felt like I was immersed. Like I was very aware I was reading a book the entire time, and half the time that I was reading this, I was away with the fairies because I couldn't concentrate. But I'm gonna read book 2 and I can't tell you why. So that's my review on this book, my final book of August. And I did finish this on the very last day of the month, so I don't really have any currently reading that I'm taking forward into September. I have started 3 books. I'm filming this on the 1st. I've started 3 books and I've read like 30 pages of each of them. We'll see what happens with that. It's not promising when I do that, because it's normally that I can't make a decision, and in not making a decision I spend all of my time dithering instead of reading. That's where I'm currently at, and that was my August wrap up. I think I did a good job of being pretty concise there. I'm proud of me for reading over 5,000 pages, and I'm also proud of what I feel is an efficient wrap up. I mean, we'll see, because I have no concept right now of how much footage I have for this video. But before I sign out, I did just want to once again say a big thank you to Book of the Month for sponsoring this video. If you would like to check out Book of the Month for yourself, please don't forget that you can click on the link in my description, enter the code Becca at checkout, and get your first book of the month for just $9.99. But aside from that, guys, down in the comments, please let me know if you read any of these books and what you guys thought of them. And aside from that, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it, and subscribe if you wanna. If you head to my description box, you'll find links to my Goodreads, Instagram, and Twitter if you'd like to follow me on any of those, as well as a link to my Bookish Kindle website, the Etsy for that, and a 10% off discount code. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye!
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go where nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.